Super. Okay, good morning. I hope you are all doing well. We are going to be following on from today on the knee that we have introduced and covered last session with me, which was the assessment of the knee. And today we're going to be using this hour to be able to look at a graded loading program, which is ultimately, I'm speaking up here, ultimately a return to knee flexion and high and fast loading, graduated return to knee flexion and high and fast loading. Okay, so important point to be able to get straight off the bat is that this is not, this loading framework here is to be played with, understanding how it works. I've even got programming here that I've made that you can use and even replicate, but it's designed for being able to take it and adapt. So, you know, I haven't made this based on doing this with nothing at home like many of the other things that we would prescribe or do based on back or neck rehab. So this is largely a loading gym-based program because the research on patella tendinopathy says that it is it's one joint that really benefits from getting into the gym and being able to get really high loading. So you guys are going to be graduating as healthcare professionals and you may not have access to a gym, but what you will be able to do is give people evidence-based programming. You could work through telehealth. And, you know, I always remember Pete Malliaris telling us a story about a chiropodist who is a person who specializes in feet, I believe. A chiropodist that he once taught to be able to prescribe heavy, slow resistance, which was, you know, people go to chiropodists because they've got problems with their feet. So obviously they're going to end up hearing about people who have heel pain and all sorts of things. And Pete Malliaris had a client come to him who went to a chiropodist who prescribed to them heavy, slow resistance calf raises, bent leg calf raises, and Pete later found out that that chiropodist had been on some of Pete Malliaris's courses around Achilles tendinopathy. So, you know, the fact that you guys don't have access to a gym, I don't buy into the fact that you know, I think it's within our scope as chiropractors to be given evidence-based musculoskeletal rehabilitation healthcare advice and prescription. So, you know, whilst being able to adapt and being able to not need anything is a really awesome thing for your own adaptability to be able to set up and work in lots of scenarios. Being able to have at least an exposure to being able to prescribe some prescriptive loading protocols is what this session is all about. So we're going to be going through and I'll be sharing videos today. We'll get as much done as we can in the hour. It's the slides are uploaded onto Blackboard, so you now have my whole patella tendon loading program on Blackboard that you can download, you can keep. I'll be changing it, evolving it as time goes on, as hopefully we all will be throughout our entire practice. And I will just drop in here that there is I'm going to be running a internship for healthcare professionals. It'll be 12 weeks and it will be based on 12 weeks learning to move. It's going to be encompassing all of my lectures here, which we've pre-recorded. I've got a movement specialist that is one of my mentors that will be teaching to be able to work with tasks, be able to work with flowing movement, to be able to work with problem solving. And through that process as well, it's going to be 12 weeks at the end of this year. There's going to be support package with everything that a healthcare professional needs to know for being able to have the confidence to set up on their own from a small business perspective. And it will also include the Bacteries chalkboard, so how you package all of this up to put it into a process, go through the clinical model, and also learn how to sell it, go through the business model. So if anybody is interested in that, I will be releasing those details out to my direct messages over the next week or so that there's a chance for people to have payment plans to be able to go through it, because I've designed it so that people can do it alongside another job, also whilst going through university. So that's something that get in contact with me if that does interest anybody in this group. Comment in here, everyone. Any first year graduate discount First year graduate discount, open to suggestion, Lou. But I'm incredibly proud of what it is based on what I've seen of what I think healthcare professionals need to try and level up and work with the new evidence-based approach, and what it is as a package. I'm really excited to be able to bring that to the field. So anybody interested, and let me know. But let's crack on with the lecture at hand. Here we are. So quick review, we went through patella tendinopathy. We went through looking at who gets it, which is largely your athletes, your most powerful jumpers. We looked at things that are going to aggravate it, your compressive movements, kneeling, deep knee flexion, high and fast load, so running, jumping. These things are going to be aggravating in that inferior pole of the patella tendon. And we looked at some differentials around patellofemoral knee pain and other things and other populations that might present with knee pain. Loading will have changed somewhere, and that is what we need to try and establish in the history, because it can hide in some interesting places. Looked at a couple of tests to help us to be able to diagnose it. And then we went through the load intolerance gradient to go through and test the compression that is tolerated with the decline squat, and then some incremental loading protocols from double leg with a stiff knee all the way through to forward triple hops to be able to find what someone's load tolerance is. I spent 2 days on the weekend with Jeremy Lewis, who I shared a lot of his work as the basis for what I built on with the shoulder that I took you guys through, which was really cool. He's a really smart guy, produced an incredible amount of research in the field. And just something I took from there that I wanted to pass on and share with you was, he does not use numbers for pain anymore, and hasn't for some time. So the VAS of, is it this number out of 10, even though his research will say we need to work with up to maybe 3, 4, 5 out of 10 as acceptable pain, he will use purely the report of the person who's experiencing pain as mild, moderate, or severe. Or he converts that into a traffic light system, where mild is green, moderate is amber, and severe is red. So the person will describe whether, once we can get across, and this is what he also drove home, is that with these persistent pain presentations, we have absolute confidence that when someone has more pain in their knee, for example, or in their back, we are not causing more damage, and we have to be able to get that across with our patient without panicking, coming across calm and composed. And then if we have that confidence, we are not causing more damage in these persistent presentations, then it's about, is the pain that you're describing after your run, after your long day at work, whatever it is, after this activity, to you, is that acceptable? Is that mild? Is that moderate? That helps us decide whether that is where we're at the moment, or whether we need to step back. So that's what we're doing when we're testing these low tolerance tests, is establishing what is unacceptable for the person as they present to us. We need to be able to use the loading gradient so that we can ramp up and make the logical progression all the way through to high and fast loading. Again, outcome measures, we looked at the muscle tendon unit testing. We looked at the optimal way to do that with being gym based, as opposed to a wall sit, which is more of a more accessible maybe to people, but not as targeted into the patella. And also the kinetic chain, so looking at the posterior chain, we talked about hamstring bridge ups, the calf, so calf raise, and then maybe some other things like hip extension, which we would include in the program. Spend a bit more time on those when we get to the calf and the hamstring lecture. That was really important. What we got to there was that for these people, high and fast loading, so running is going to be a problem, particularly running downhill, because each one of them is like a single leg horizontal landing. So running downhill and loading, we might have had to load manage 50 or up to even 100% of saying that we can't do that for a period of time. That'll include running and jumping, kneeling down on the floor. Can we find ways to change those activities? And really high load deep knee flexion, I've seen here with this front squat, is going to be problematic. So those are the things that you're going to want to be momentarily putting the brakes on with people. And if we can do that, generally a lot of things will settle down. Okay, with your athletes, we're getting them to slow down. They're the ones that are a little bit more challenging to get them to do that. But the load management is arguably the most important thing, because there's so many ways that we can reload as long as we can have a logical progressive program, which you'll have in here of one way of doing that. We look at some adjunctive things like taping and changing the footwear, so changing the processing through the knees, and that's, you know, as described, that's things that depend on your skill set as a clinician as to whether you do taping or whether you know, the research on insoles is that it doesn't have to be a really expensive custom one, just changing your footwear. So something that I will often do is go between barefoot and a big thick heel if my Achilles or my knee are particularly playing me up. So similar advice could be helpful for who you're working with. So here's the loading frameworks that we're going to be looking at and putting some meat on here. Level 1, and you'll notice these are all about acceptable pain. So the numbers are on here, 3 out of 10 through those load tolerance tests. So you look at, you know, if someone's flared up unacceptable just with your orthopedic testing and or a little bit of functional testing, then they're going to be in at level 1. They're going to be doing their isometrics. Okay, we've got the programming for that in here. But as soon as we can get to level 2, which is your heavy slow resistance, then that's where we want to start. And as soon as we can, and you'll see the entrance here, 20 double leg hops. So if we're biasing the knee, which we're doing here, it would be with a soft knee rather than a locked knee, which we would use to bias the Achilles. If that's acceptable, then we can start training that high and fast loading. And then when 10 single leg hops don't irritate, so single leg with a soft knee, then we simultaneously can bring back in and grade up running at the same time. Really nice little framework there to be able to bear in mind, because they help find the entry. Something, again, that Jeremy Lewis drove home on the weekends. The hardest thing in rehab for all of us is finding the entry point, finding where we start, because then we can, you know, once we find that entry point, we find what someone's able to tolerate, what aggravates, what doesn't. As long as we've got a clear goal, we can then manipulate variables to be able to find a way to get there. But having these tests as a guide for which one of the hop in, which one of the jump in would lead to a start. And most people we're going to hopefully start at level 2. But here's, if level 2 isn't tolerated, here is going to be how we might apply some isometrics. So if you haven't got a gym, then you can prescribe this through showing them and describing to them, you know, can you get access to one of these knee machines in a leisure center in some local gym that is near to you, and being able to keep out from the deep ranges of knee flexion, where, remember, not knee flexion is going to be provocative often. Maybe the top range is provocative, but what we want to be doing with these isometrics is as much resistance as possible for your sets of 30 plus seconds. So that would be doing that on a knee extension. Another really good option, if I can just get this to play, is a leg press. And the reason that this is a really good option is because you can get so much weight on there, you can really have high maximal effort with a range of movement that is tolerable, that is acceptable. We've got some research from Pete Morris's group that 1.5 to 2 times body weight for heavy slow resistance through these is a goal that they've produced for setting in rehab. So again, you may not have access to these, but because of the very fact that they bring so much load through the entire of the lower body, that is another really nice option for doing isometrics. And if we don't have access to a gym, there are some versions that we can do that don't involve a gym, because again, we just want to get as much of a contraction as we can in an acceptable range. This is a Spanish squat. Now, I can't remember if any of you guys were in the practical lab last year where I did this with Sam from your group. you know, because this is an exercise that looks like nothing. So it's almost like a replica of the decline squat, so that you're keeping your torso upright. You've got a strong band that's going around the top of your tibias, and then you're holding this, an angle of the knee here that is tolerable for your pain. So you don't want to be down at 90 degrees if that's provocative. This position here and taking a step further back into the band is going to make this more challenging. And if you remember Big Sam, he was shaking like a tree, which he'll describe himself if you remember. But what we need to be able to do there is to be able to know when to stop, or when to be able to take the tension off so that someone can get out safely. But we need to try and get the maximal load we can. One of the critiques of the Spanish squat is the fact that it is bilateral. And often when you do things bilateral and you have a problem in one limb, your good lat side will take over. So here is how we might do a single leg Spanish squat. And again, you'll see this band pulling me now. So there's a lot of resistance into that position. Get your balance. Maybe you need something to be able to hold on next to you or to your person, but then we can find a position that we can tolerate the angle and be able to spend some time, 30 to 45 second sets in that position. But remember, we're moving on from isometrics as soon as we can. This is level 1, so this is the lowest level of entry that we want to be getting people for their loading through the knee. Here's an example of something that would be much lower load, but maybe more applicable to someone who is maybe a bit older, or someone who is less functional, is to be able to find some way of being able to replicate the setup with very limited things at hand. Okay, so we're looking to try and get symptoms under control, and there's our prescription there. Maximum resistance, and we could do this up to 3 times a day. You know, we could do, depending on how intolerant somebody is, or how sensitive someone is, would guide why we do it. But then we've also got to think, you know, are we doing this as pain relief? Because that has been shown in some research to give pain relief up to an hour, but then in other people it doesn't. It flares them up, as we looked at with the, you know, the altered descending inhibitory system of people with persistent pain. So, you know, that's what we've got to be able to be flexible enough to be able to try it and to be able to shift if it's not received well. So moving on to level 2, which is where we want to try and get to as soon as we can. Here are some really good exercises to have in your arsenal for ways that you can modify the range of movement so that we're not going too far into knee flexion, and it's heavy slow resistance. Okay, so I've put here the limitation at the top is that we're staying under 80 degrees knee flexion, and this would be done up to 3 times a week. But of course, when you're working with a person, you are probably going to be getting them to do as much as they're able to do within their life. With working with athletes, maybe you've got to manage to say, right, we've got to try and space this out. Let's see what it's like for 2 times a week, and to see how you might progress this through this program that I've outlined. Because 4-week blocks are a useful way to try and have as a thought process that you could update and modify if someone's not responding. Now, the numbers that are in here, as I said in the introduction, it's like a nice way to look at this. It's a graduated knee flexion high and fast loading program. So the numbers in here, so the single leg extension, which is heavy slow resistance. So like the isometric that I showed you there, this is a link here to my YouTube channel, but I'm not going to click that in case it throws us out. Would be heavy slow resistance, so 3 seconds down, 3 seconds up, within a range of movement that is acceptable pain. Okay, so not worried about going into deep knee flexion there, and maybe not even worried about the top 10 degrees of extension. We're looking to get as much resistance as we can through the range that is available to them, and that range can maybe nudge a little bit over the course of time. But 40 to 60 kilograms is numbers from Pete Malaris's gym. So whilst we can take from that you know, he produces a lot of the primary research on this area, so it carries some weight. You know, his machines are going to be different to the ones that I've got access to here, the ones that you would have when gyms reopen again. So we've got to be able to to adapt these. This is the single leg press that we looked at there, 1.5 to 2 times body weight. So if I'm just under 100 kilograms at the moment. So for me, with my patella tendinopathy, getting a goal of being able to do 6 reps single leg press with 200 kilograms heavy slow resistance. And if you haven't ever done that, that's hard. That's going to be hard, and that's going to take me some training to be able to do that. And that's where I think the value largely is in these programs, is the process of the adaptation as opposed to the actual achieving of a certain number. A couple of other really nice exercises to include for some variety is 1990 standing split squat and the step up. So I've got a video to be able to show of a couple of those, because these have been really effective for me personally. The program in there is at the bottom of the page. Remember, I'll give you the dosages chart many times for you to become familiar with as guiding your exercise prescription. But here's what some of the heavy slow resistance isotonics might look like. So this is the 1990 split squat, which is set up. I'm set up in such a way that in the bottom position, I don't want my knees to be going past 90 degrees, because remember, that's a working basis of that is that's bringing us into more compression. That isn't bad, it's just sensitizing in these early stages where the knee is sore. So that's a 1990 split squat, and obviously if you stepped back further, you would be able to change that squat drastically. You could take the knees way past the toes, and that's something you maybe want to be working towards over time. You can get a lot of weight through that. This is a step up, and the height of the box I would choose would be, again, so that in this position, arguably you'd say I'm at 90 degrees there, but you could have, I was able to tolerate that. You could have a plate underneath the floor or something here or some way of modifying that height so that it's not as high. You start off maybe just at 6 inches, and that's another nice movement. That's standing, that box step up, and the slowness of the movement is a really challenging balance component to that as well. And a side note that I've put on the bottom there, when you're training these unilateral ones, is to have a minute between the sides. So if you've ever done Bulgarian split squats, or if you've done any lunge type, static lunge type movements, whichever leg goes first is always going to be significantly better than the leg that goes second, because it's also working on the first side. So to have a rest between sides and for maybe a minute, and then have 2 or 3 minutes between sets. But again, these exercises and in this range of movement, in this split squat, we could put a yoga block or something underneath the knee here if we wanted to modify the range that was tolerated. The slowness of the movement means that we want to get to doing these sorts of things, heavy slow resistance, and so single leg extension, leg press, standard split squat, and step up. You can also adapt all of those to actually be able to do versions of those that don't require a gym. Just resistance might be a little bit more difficult to progressively overload. So other things that are really helpful for creating a conditioning rehabilitation program around the knee, as we've looked at testing knee flexion, looked at testing calf raise, hip extension is something that is going to be a generally a good idea to include in these programs as well. And deadlift I've put in here because it's a movement that is largely posterior chain. It's a hamstring and back exercise. That's why a lot of people will include it as a pull. But if you just look at the knee range of movement there, I've got long legs, so my hips are high at the starting position of a deadlift anyway. But it's a good movement for getting very heavy resistance through the knee in a range that is going to be largely tolerated and acceptable, even if someone's got a really pissed off knee. So I like to include that or some version of that as a hip extension exercise. Now, just like we went through with the shoulder, I could just hit you with a load of exercises, but I'm also fully aware from my experience that finding exercises generally isn't the hard thing. You can go on YouTube and you can see any exercise. Type in patella tendinopathy exercise, and you'll see these exercises. What I think the really hard part is creating a program and the programming. You know, when I expose myself to coaches and teachers of different places, what I'm really interested in is they're probably not going to show me a new exercise. They're probably not going to show me a revolutionary thing. I really want to see the art of their programming. I want to see how they put these things together, because that's generally where the skill of the top coaches are. It's where the people who are able to work with problem solving and creating systems that people can work through really effectively is the programming. So, you know, I'm certainly no expert in this, but what I've done is try to create some little format that could make sense for being able to create programming. Okay, so if we were to create this in straight strength sets, I've made little sections here. So the warm-up would be patella isometrics. I'll put that as optional because, as I said, if we can move on to the heavy slow resistance, that is what we want to do. Someone may find isometrics helpful, so we can keep it there. And then A1, patella specific heavy slow resistance. Then B1, patella specific heavy slow resistance 2. C, knee flexion isotonics, that would be hamstring exercise. D1, calf isotonics, could be straight or bent leg. And then E1, hip extension isotonics. Okay, and I've made the order of that so that what you do first in a rehabilitation or a training session is what's going to get the most of your attention. It's also what's going to get most of your quality, and you're going to get the most out of it. So at this point in a level 2, the patella heavy slow resistance is going to be the most important. So that's why that's going to be at the start. We'll see as we work through to level 3 and level 4 that flips and ends up being as an accessory thing at the end of the session that you want to be keeping running some continuity through a program. It doesn't want to be the primary emphasis, but what it also doesn't want to be done is just left behind and, okay, I've completed heavy slow resistance. The research shows, and that's something that Jeremy Lewis drove home on the weekend as well. When we're in the game of behaviour change, what our job as healthcare professionals is arguably to be able to get people to appreciate the true preventative medicine of physical activity, and resistance training is something across all those guidelines. So strength training of some capacity is something that's really helpful, or resistance training, because it doesn't have to be strength, but resistance training is something that is arguably a lifelong pursuit that we can expose people to. So if I was to plug in some of the exercises we've just looked at into these categories, you know, this is what it might look like, and the programming that I've provided for you. So the warm-up could be single leg press isometrics at 80 degrees or less, 5 sets of 30 with 2 minutes rest. You know, I've tried to take control of every single variable here that you could look at it and say, and you could copy it, add lib, and it tells you the exact thing to do, including what, you know, reps in reserve, rest periods. You know, some people don't respond well to that, so having that thought process of how do I translate this to somebody else's, you know, that's part of the art of working with a person. But A1, single leg extension, 3 to 4 sets, 6 to 8 reps. There's the tempo, 3 seconds up, 3 seconds down, and you go to until you've got 1 rep in reserve, or 1 rep away from not being able to get another repetition. Or another way would be saying that of RPE 9, which is rate of perceived exertion, which is just subjective scales. But if you've been doing this, and when people have been doing this for a period of time, you do get quite accurate with knowing I've only got 1 or 2 reps left. So it's something that takes a little bit of practice. And if you're working with a person, you know, get to the end of the set, how many reps do you reckon you had there if you'd have carried on? You start getting people comfortable with that idea. So maybe we do single leg extensions, and then we can move on to 90-90 standing split squat. There's your programming. Single leg hamstring bridge up, standing 2 leg calf raise, deadlift. Okay, and if someone was pressed for time and wanted to maybe have a variety on setup, you could add in supersets, where I've plugged in there. You know, you could do your patella heavy slow resistance superset with a knee flexion. So I've put a prone double leg hamstring curl here with a single leg press. And then in the second one, B1 and B2, I have put step up, which we looked at before, with calf isotonics, bent leg version. Okay. How much does somebody do? Well, maybe you can only get them to do 1 exercise to start with, and it's just the knee extension isotonics, knee extensions. And then you can get them to be able to find a way of doing that, and then we can maybe add in a calf raise. So you have this as a thought process that guides where you might go with somebody. What's going on here? This is what a week might look like if you were to try and include some variety around the exercise that someone might do. But if we change things up too much, then we don't drive adaptation. And in a patella tendinopathy, we are looking to drive and target conditioning through the knee in that range. So here, maybe we do single leg extension for your 3 to 4 sets and 90-90 split squat. The green I've highlighted for the patella emphasis. But then on the second session, we do single leg press instead of single leg extension, and we do step up instead of split squat. So we have continuity and progress through these two, and a different hamstring exercise for both of them, and different hip extension. I put a hip thrust here, trying to pick hip extension exercises that don't take you into deep knee flexion. And how might you do this is, alternate sessions. So if someone can get 3 sessions per week, then you have session A, session B, session A. If someone can only do twice a week, session A, session B, and just cycle that for a 4-week block, 5 or 6 week block if we're seeing progress, and then look to be able to progress within the variables that I'm offering. So here is, any questions or anything around what I've offered up to this point? I'm conscious that I am just speaking, and I know that if I don't try and go through this quite quickly, then you won't have at least had me take you through all the slides. But if there is any questions or anything, please jump on either the chat or bang it in. I can hear it when someone pumps something in there, but I'll rattle on if there's not. Now, level 3. So we're going back to our load tolerance testing, and we're doing some, looking at the top slide here, double leg counter movement jumps. Okay, so we've gone back to being able to do the soft knee, and we're doing maximal counter movement jumps, double leg, and someone has acceptable pain, which means that we are able to start progressing either in terms of range of movement, or so going back and nudging towards the compression, or we can be including that high and fast loading, which their testing says that they're able to do. So how do we do that to exercises we've just looked at? Well, the split squat can turn into jumping split squats, types of leg press and forms of squatting can turn into counter movement jumps, and we can start looking at forward hopping. And the programming here at the bottom is much lower resistance, much higher velocity. Because remember, the rate of loading in plyometrics is what really gets the connective tissue, which is why heavy slow resistance is well tolerated, but rebound is something that is often provocative. And as and when we're working through the program, we want to be able to assess and get feedback to be able to know when someone can progress past 80 degrees of knee flexion. So here's a barbell squat where I'm going to go full depth, and full depth for me is, that's a full range squat that I'm able to do, which is to maximal knee flexion. So as and when someone is able to tolerate going past 90 degrees, we have indication to be able to train that. And I've got a slower tempo that I'm working to here, and what I want to run this through is to illustrate that in level 3 is one way to program is to add the high and fast loading after the heavy slow resistance work. So these are sets of 6 to 8, I think. Just roll that on. Immediately afterwards, going into your triple forward hop, which is going to be much higher loading on the patella. Triple bounce for distance and stick the third one. Boom, boom. Find ways to be able to create tasks that require the tempo to increase. So this is where I think a landmine is useful, because you'll look at the knees here and see that this is the split squat position, and being able to get a landmine overhead encourages to be able to get the faster velocity isotonics at the bottom. So doing a sort of 2-second negative there and then out the bottom as fast as possible. Okay, I like that as a way of being able to encourage higher velocity isotonics, and we can even work towards being able to look at ways of plyometrically coming into knee flexion. So that's about the bottom of my squat, but being able to come up and land in there is going to be like a step towards dropping down from that, going the other way from there and dropping, jumping out is going to be a much higher loading than landing and accepting in the bottom of a knee flexion. But what I'm illustrating in that point there is that in level 3, from where you've established someone's tolerance with those very slow prescriptive movements, is to be able to start thinking about ways of releasing the constraints for being able to encourage higher tempo, maybe higher range of movement. Now, when we are able to tolerate 2-leg hopping, this is where we can start bringing in the variable hop protocol, which is something that Igor Sancho's developed. And the programming is up here on the top left. So 3 sets of 60 double leg stiff knee, 3 sets of 30 double leg soft knee, 3 sets of 5 double leg forwards and backwards, 3 sets of 5 double leg to step. Now, this is a protocol for being able to get 2-legged plyometrics retrained, and I'm going to let this run here for you can see me going through some of these. When someone is able to tolerate this, we wouldn't want to just chuck the whole protocol at somebody because it's going to flare them up. So maybe you just do A1 the first week, see how they get on with that. Can you find ways to make it a little bit more interesting? This is what I'm illustrating here with the jump rope, is being able to find some skill-based stuff that you actually look at the mechanics of the lower body. That's still, you know, your 3 sets of 60 double leg with a stiff knee. But then maybe the following week they're able to do 3 sets of 60, but then also able to go on to the 3 sets of 30 with the soft knee, which is this one here, which is far more biased towards the knee. Okay, so this deeper knee and maximal jumps is going to be a much more intense level on the knee. If you wanted to chuck a jump rope in with that, then maybe a double under, but of course it's, you know, someone may not have they may not enjoy jump rope, or they may not have the perseverance to develop the skill. Here's what forwards and backwards might look like, and a couple of progressions around taking that forwards and backwards to some more progressive heights, as shown with a couple of hurdles there. Of course, you could do that, go to even higher heights, and hopefully you could also see that you could start making this move in different directions, which is things that we might do as if we're working with other knee presentations, like an ACL, person who's had surgery, or anything else. But the framework there is really helpful to be able to see. That's called the variable hop program, and that is, I haven't got that filmed with the 2-legged, but with the single-legged, but the single-leg version is very much the same, and obviously doubles up the loading on each leg that is doing that. Velocity isotonics. Now this is where we're going to be looking to apply the high and fast loading, the power-based phase into the knee, where I've got some versions here. This is maybe a jumping split squat with dumbbells. Cast your mind back to the programming, 4 sets of 6 to 8 with 20 to 30% of what you were doing with the split squat for heavy slow resistance. Here's how we might use something else to do some counter movement, weighted counter movement jumps. This is a deadlift hex bar. Not about being really heavy here, it's about trying to jump as explosively as we can. Whoops. I don't know if you can see that, but that's a light barbell jump as high as possible, but it's that acceptance of coming out the bottom That is where we're really interested in. Triple forward hop, which is in our testing for the horizontal component. Okay, so moving between level 3 and level 4 is a bit of a blur. It will be likely that someone will maybe be ready to go into level 4, which is going to be much more of this plyometric type stuff, but then they become sensitized, need to step back to level 3. Someone may get a real flare up that's out of our control when they're going back to performing. They have to go right back to level 2, but the understanding and awareness of these levels is what's really important. The graded return back to high and fast loading. And here is an example of a 12-week program that I've made that would fit into this level 3 or 4. So we've done the load management and we've done the heavy slow resistance with just the patella. Hopefully you'll see that this will be the framework that I've used for the Achilles, for the hamstring as well, but we just changed what the exercises are. And this would be a 12-week program that is 4-week blocks that moves through a first emphasis of strength, then strength speed, then speed specific. So it's 2 sessions per week that I'm not going to spend too much time on here now because you can look at it. The only other place that this will be available will be on the mentorship that we'll be going through at the end of the year, but you guys have got it now. And here's the section. So I'll just talk you through the sections. Lower body bilateral. So I've picked a movement that is that fits that. The barbell squat, there's various ways of barbell squatting. Of course, remember we're talking about whether the range of movement is acceptable. Then lower body split stance, so standing barbell split squat. I put in plyometric movements after the exercise in here as well. I like a whole body landmine because of that, as I said, that task that requires us to produce a fast or velocity isotonix, and then look where the heavy slow resistance has gone, to the bottom of the session. So this is where I've put limb specific isolation, where you would do single leg quad extensions for your 6 to 8 reps, 3-0-3-0, but given some options for what you could do also with a knee flexion one, and you could even change that into a superset if someone wanted to be able to get it done in a shorter period of time. Okay, as you work through that session B, so that's slightly different exercises but the same categories. Put in a deadlift, a couple of different landmine exercise, but everything else in there is the same. As we work through, so this is the second block, weeks 5 to 8. The reps scheme changes slightly to shift to a little bit lower, and a couple of variations on the landmine exercise. Same here, the kettlebell swing is a version of being able to develop some speed through hip extension. And then weeks 9 to 12 is where you're into this power velocity phase, 20 to 30%, so barbell jump squats, alternating jump split squats, a couple of stuff that I've put in here, like landmine partner throws, where you punch the barbell, and it's just ways of trying to get whole body movements back through the knee. I draw your attention and remind you to this slide here, which is an illustration of the bird's eye nature of load management. Is where someone's come, knees intolerant of loads of tasks that are going to generally be high and fast loading or stretch shortening cycle. So we're going to have to manage that, stop someone doing those things, get someone heavy slow resistance. That's what's along the bottom here, which arguably runs forever. Maybe the exercise changes and we don't need to be doing heavy slow resistance forever, but some form of resistance training is probably a good lifelong pursuit. And this continues whilst we work back up the stretch shortening cycle load tolerance ladder, which we haven't touched on yet from a running perspective, but we have been looking at how we might change the Isotonix through the range of movement and through to plyometric and hopping. So once someone is able to tolerate the single leg hopping, this is where the protocol would shift to being single leg, and then we have permission to be able to get going with running, graded amounts of running. So this is what I described earlier, where we're not going to just say, right, okay, you've not been able to do high and fast loading for several months, now go and have a go at doing this protocol, because that is one surefire way of fucking someone up. especially someone who's put in loads of work to get their pain acceptable in the knee, we have to be able to grade this. So week 1 might just look like the double, level the warm up and A. Is it acceptable? Then we can add that in, and then we can work to the 15 times 3 single leg soft knee. So imagine that video I showed you before, going over the hurdles, going onto the step, that being single leg. And within that, being able to do the protocol is one thing, then being able to improve your landing quality, your explosiveness. Maybe you can add some tasks where someone's got to have a ball so that they're actually receiving something that they're having to keep their eyes on and focus rather than thinking about the floor. That's where we can change the intensity of these things as we work through. But this is, if you remind what the level 4 looks like here, you've got your Isotonix up to 3 times a week, and now you've got the single leg hot protocol once a week and running up to twice a week, which is going to be based on somebody's envelope of function. Let me just check where I've got that. It's going to be there. Here's an unpredictability plyometric task that me and Paul have used a lot, something that we've adapted from movement culture, but this is where we're now able to tolerate single legs. So we have, if I look at A1 here, left leg, we do 50 reps single leg jumps. So using a jump rope, if someone didn't have the skill to be able to use a jump rope and we're getting really frustrated, then you could do this without a jump rope. But this is pre-fatiguing, and immediately after this, drop the rope. And now, I've put the first one here, which is a link to the YouTube, where you would simply try and stand still with your eyes closed for 60 seconds on that fatigued single leg. If you have a go at that later, or have a go at that sometime this week, you will realize that that is much harder than it sounds. And then we've got some other progressions here. So we would be able to do some maybe single leg stick evasion, which is where I would be on my single leg, and then Paul has either his arms or a stick, and I'm trying to dodge the stick in a way that it's very challenging in terms of my ability to be able to manage my body position. And where Paul would put the stick might dictate whether I go down into deeper ranges of knee flexion and what have you. But what we're looking at here that's playing in the background is a stick and land variation, which is I have to jump, again, stay on that single leg after pre-fatiguing it, and then my partner can or cannot push me in any direction at any time when I'm in the air, and then I have to try and stick the land in without too much shuffling about. You can do that at a much high level, again, with eyes closed, but as a partner and a person who's giving the perturbation or the input, that is going to be the skill of knowing how much you can and can't put into your person that you're working with. I'll leave that run there because that is a good question, Lewis. You have to develop a therapeutic alliance and have as much protection in place for you to be working as a practitioner to know and decide whether you want to be able to take people up to these high levels of return to play. But the question comes from a rehabilitation perspective. Does my own fear around being sued, around somebody getting injured over or outweigh the requirement that, you know, this person needs to get back to playing hockey, where the loads are going to be far more unpredictable and higher. And if we're not prepared for that, well, you know, this is the conversation that we have with our patient to be able to say, you know, are you up for being able to be taken through a return to play? If that's what you want to be able to do, then arguably, you know, what I'm saying to you is that the training and preparation for that actually needs to be harder than that. You know, if you're preparing for a fight, Lewis, then, and your coach doesn't prepare your sparring that's going to be harder than that fight, then, you know, that coach has let you down. So being able to have that reality of that conversation, if, you know, if that dialogue and that isn't there, then, you know, you stick to being very safe and get someone out of pain, and then they can deal with function themselves. I've had people who would, someone who came to me with a knee dislocation. They had chronic instability, and then in return to, after 6 months of rehab, in returning them to be able to go back and play hockey, they dislocated the other knee. Had to get air ambulance into the gym, the lot, you know. And so the risk there is, you know, they could sue me, they could say, you know, they injured my knee, but the honest conversation was, you know, that either happened here with me, or that happened when you were going back to play hockey, which is something that you want to be able to go and do. And ultimately, you know, that is a risk when anyone wants to be able to get back to playing sports. We know that there is an inherent risk of injury. So that's a good question, Lewis, because you have to have been able to thought and be able to factor these things in when we are working with people, because you do need to cover yourselves. Okay, so this is a basketball case that Pete Malaris used for getting someone back to jumping. So this is what his return to sport phase looked like as a session 2 to 3 times a week, which is the variable hop, which you've just seen, some counter movement jumps and split squat jumps, maximal forward triple hops, and then layups, so making it relevant to the task that someone needs to get back to being able to do. You know, we need to have balanced out strength side to side before we're going on to these heavy, slow resistance, before we're going on to this high and fast loading. And that is something that is the early stages, or the early goal of our initial stages of rehab. And then when we're getting back to running, you know, this is a framework for being able to get someone to be able to nudge up their capacity of running in a logical way, week by week, that is going to be dependent on how much running they previously were able to do. So if you've got someone who was an Ironman and they're able to do, I don't know, 100 kilometer run, and we're saying, look, we're going to have you load manage, to get less 25%. So this person's load management, they're only doing 25% of their normal running, but normal for them is 100 kilometer races. So they're still able to run 25 kilometers, which most of us would not be able to do without screaming shin splints and knee pain, because we're not conditioned to it. So that's always going to be relative. And that's where we need to have a framework of being able to return back in based on what someone's conditioning and history is. So we need to be able to have that structure initially. So, you know, find your baseline, maybe it's a 5-minute run, jog, and then we add 3 minutes per run. Given that structure that gives someone the framework for being able to then probably regulate it themselves to be able to get going. We mentioned at the start that when it comes to patella, it's going to be largely downhill that is going to be provocative, and this is a high and fast or a sprinting returning protocol, which Pete Malaris uses for his hamstrings and people who need to return to sprinting. So they use like a rugby pitch or an Aussie rules pitch, which is like an oval where you can see there where you run at the short ends, and then you jog at the long ends. And if you do that for 6 laps, that would be 2 kilometers of running, 600 meters fast, 1200 meters of jogging, and being able to have a grading of that for intensity from, you know, when you're doing your sprints across the short end, going at 30%. Complete the protocol for 1 set or 2 sets or 3 sets, depending on the volume that you need to be able to run, and then being able to ramp up over the course of 4 to 6 weeks when you're doing this regularly, is to get to the point where you can tolerate 100% running. And I would even bias that to doing that not on a football pitch or a sports pitch, but outside on a downhill, if it's a Patella, or out on the rough terrain of running across country, if that's something that you do. So being able to have this as a framework protocol, hopefully that's really helpful for you, because you could see, right, what is roughly a 30 to 50 meter sprint and versus 100-meter jog. Well, you could make that into an interval session that is, right, I'm going to be running fast for 10 seconds or 15 seconds or 5 seconds, you know, gauge how far you could go in that period of time, and then you can just use a stopwatch being out on the road or out in the countryside. Okay, so that's a nice protocol again that I wanted to share with you guys. I'm not, oh shit. It's just kicked me out. It's kicked me out of my Google. Fuck. Right, I've been kicked out of my Google, so I'm gonna have to go and sort that out. The time is 3 minutes to. The rest of the wrapping up of the lecture there is on Blackboard, and the final parts is just an idea of being able to track using a spreadsheet or using a notebook, sharing what a lot of people use, something called PhysiTrack, which has got templates in there. And that's something that you maybe want to consider. But I hope the session was helpful. I'm going to have to go and try and sort this out because I can't remember my password to get back in. And I will see you guys in a month where we're going to be probably applying this to the Achilles. Okay, cheers guys, take care, have a good Easter.